When you think about financial planning, what comes to mind? Stocks, bonds, RRSPs, maybe an education fund for your kids? But what about estate planning, specifically a will? Though creating one, or even updating an existing one, is something that's easy to put off.
For sure. And these are big decisions that have real meaty implications in terms of relationships and family dynamics. And so like any major decision, it can sometimes lead to procrastination.
That's our guest this episode, Rob McGavin. He's the managing director at Scotiatrust. So he knows that wills combine the two things people often dislike discussing the most: money and death.
And so it can be an uncomfortable thing to talk about, but it just makes sense to address it and be prepared. It's fine to think you've got lots of time to deal with this, but none of us knows when exactly that time's going to come.
Rob's here to walk us through everything we need to know about this potentially thorny but important document, one that's foundational to estate planning and therefore key to a larger financial plan. We'll cover the basics from exactly what a will is, why you need one and where to get it, and go a little deeper. We'll explore what roles you might need to assign and who can best fill them, how often to update a will, how to avoid common family conflicts, and more. After all, a will isn't just about money.
If there's something that's important to you, that you want to happen a certain way when you pass away, then the best way to make sure that that happens is to capture it in a will.
I'm Stephen Maurice, and this is Perspectives. Rob, welcome back to the show. Great to have you on.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so we're going to start with something pretty basic, a couple of definitions. This may seem super simplistic, but let's do it anyway. What is a will?
A will, first of all, is a legal document. It's really all about outlining your wishes for what's going to happen when you pass away. It's an opportunity to talk about how you want your assets distributed, who's going to take care of any minor children that you have. It's a chance to identify who you want to be responsible for doing all of this.
Okay, and one more definition. We actually covered this the last time you were on the show, but just quickly, what's a POA or a power of attorney?
Yeah, power of attorney, really it's somebody who is stepping into your shoes and making decisions on your behalf when you're unable to do so yourself, often because you've become incapacitated, either physically or mentally. There's two types of POAs that you need to be thinking about. One is for finances, what we typically call POA for property. That would deal with anything financial related, right? Making decisions about, investments, banking, real estate, things like that. The other one is about personal care. That goes by different names depending on the province that you're in, but essentially it's about making decisions about somebody's healthcare, their accommodations, end of life type of decisions. So both of those POAs are really important companions to the will. The will is kind of 1A in terms of having document preparation, POA is 1B.
Okay. And so often people would get those at the same time.
You would often, right? And we certainly would encourage people to do that.
Okay. And as I mentioned, we have a whole episode out on powers of attorney, so we won't be talking about POAs in detail. If our listeners want to hear that episode, they can find it in our feed, and we'll link to it in the show notes. So back to wills. Why would someone need a will?
Well, a will makes sure that the things that you want to have happen. As I said, it's that chance to outline your intentions around how all these things are going to happen, your assets, your family, et cetera. If you don't have that, then you're really leaving it up to provincial law to dictate how it happens. And so it's about maintaining control and ensuring that your wishes are ultimately followed. Not having a will, that can, as I said, you're giving up that control, but you're also potentially leading to delays, costs, and unintended outcomes, which could include things related to your family. And if family harmony is of any concern, then the will is one of those mechanisms that's going to allow you to be able to try to mitigate those concerns.
And do most people have a will? How many Canadians have one? Is that an issue?
Yeah, it certainly is. I mean, we see often in research pretty consistently that roughly half of Canadians have a will, which means half of them don't. You do see that number increase typically as you get older or clients that have a little bit more wealth. Just because they have more complexity, more things going on, they really need to provide that guidance. We did some research at Scotiatrust a couple of years ago amongst older, more affluent Canadians, and we did see a pretty high number of Canadians who did have them, which was great, 90%. Wow. Although I'd say 2/3 of them hadn't updated it in some time, and almost half of them didn't have those two types of powers of attorney that we talked about. So even though you start to see the numbers improve, overall, they're still pretty low, and there's still lots of room for improvement in terms of Canadians' level of readiness.
Okay, and when should people be thinking about getting a will? Because I would imagine it's younger people who, for the most part, wouldn't have them, and then they would think about getting one later in life, I guess.
Typically, more so for sure. As I said, you tend to see older Canadians more likely to have one.
Right.
The reality is there really isn't an age limit. And frankly, I would say it's not necessarily about how much you have or how old you are. It's, do you have intentions that you want to make clear and wishes that you want followed? Anybody who's an adult basically could start to end up in that category. And so I would say that we really want to encourage people to be thinking about it sooner rather than later.
Right. So what does that mean then? As soon as you're sort of working age, as soon as you've started making any money, but I guess also even if you care about where you're going to be buried or what your funeral is going to look like or whatever, if that's something that's important to you, you could put that in writing as early as you want.
Absolutely. I think there are probably some milestones in life that act as natural triggers to tell us that we probably should be doing this now. You know, that's buying a first house or getting married, having kids would be a big one. Right. You know, starting a business, all sorts of things that now start to introduce complexity and really other responsibilities that you want to make sure are followed when you're not there. But as you say, like, it's also just about instructions, right? If there's something that's important to you that you want to happen a certain way when you pass away, then the best way to make sure that that happens is to capture it in a will.
Right. So for a lot of people, maybe they hear about wills, it might sound kind of scary, or it's, you know, legalistic paperwork or whatever. Maybe people just don't want to think about their own demise. Are those sort of the common hurdles for people who are not getting a will?
For sure. I have to think at the top of the list is just not wanting to actually have to think about and talk about a topic that can be uncomfortable for people, right? Our own deaths. I would say that whenever we see clients that don't have them, I think they know that they should have them. And so it's about procrastination. So that's certainly at the top of the list of why. I think another reason is it requires making really big decisions. You're having to decide, how do you want your assets to be distributed? Who's going to take care of your minor children? More importantly, who's not going to take care, right? Like, these are big decisions that have real meaty implications in terms of relationships and family dynamics. And so, like any major decision, it can sometimes lead to procrastination, right? It's just easier to sort of put it off. But we certainly want to encourage people to think about this. You know, I'm sure there's no small amount of people out there that don't want to jinx themselves by turning their attention to the topic at hand. This isn't about anticipating death. This is about realizing that it's about as inevitable as anything in our lives and just simply being prepared for it.
You talked there a little bit about the other people that get drawn into a will because you're appointing people to do certain things and giving them decision-making power. How should people be thinking about that when they are getting to that point and they're making a will? Who are the people that would have to be involved in that? And how should you be making that decision?
I'd say the first role that you're going to need to think about for your will is an executor. So who do you trust to take responsibility to oversee the administration of your estate? It really needs to be somebody who is capable of doing that, has some degree of aptitude and acumen, but also is in a position where they can manage the level of work that's involved. It's not a small amount of work, but also somebody who's going to be accessible and available. You want somebody who's not living in another part of the world to have to be responsible for dealing with a lot of things in your local market. So thinking about who that executor is. And we see lots of examples when we're dealing with clients where the importance of the executor being able to be that neutral party who is trying to make those decisions. You'd be surprised at the emotional attachment that people have, say, to certain possessions that remind them of the individual that's just passed, and more than one person that wants to have those possessions. And so, you know, you can't always break these things in half or into thirds. And so how do you navigate those? How do you help negotiate how all of these different things unfold?
So without getting too deep in the weeds, what does the executor have to do? I mean, it can be a complicated process depending on the complexity of the estate and what the person wanted to have happen. But at sort of a basic level, what are the things that an executor has to do?
Yeah, I mean, think of all of the things in your life that need to be unwound. We have a checklist that I don't even know how long it is, 100 and something different items. Think about your house, dealing with all of the possessions, securing the house, dealing with the property, having to sell the property. Everything that you possess, you know, not all of it is going to go to people. Some of it is going to be maybe given to charity. Some of it is going to be thrown away. Some of it needs to be sold. You need to be dealing with valuators. Then you're talking about all your other professional advisors, investment accounts, and dealing with those, and banks and bills. You know, you need to shut off bills. So There's a lot of stuff to be dealt with, not to mention dealing with all of the tax implications, right? Filing a final T1, we call a terminal tax return, as well as ongoing tax returns while the estate is still in motion. This is not a short exercise. Administering an estate, typically, even the more straightforward estates, are likely going to take 18 to 24 months. And big part of the delays there are the court system, obtaining probate that validates that this is a valid will and the executor named is who they should be dealing with, as well as dealing with CRA, and if you're in Quebec, Road to Quebec, in getting all the proper tax clearance and filing returns. So it's quite an involved process, Stephen. And that doesn't even include communicating with beneficiaries. That can be onerous in and of itself, but when you talk about dealing with family members, it can also be emotionally draining.
Right. And maybe it would be an expectation that you'd appoint your favorite sibling to do it just because you're close or whatever, but that maybe shouldn't be how you're making that kind of decision.
Yeah. I mean, again, you want to choose somebody that you trust, who's going to follow your directions and who is going to ensure that your estate is administered and distributed the way that you want. You know, some people see it as bestowing an honor on whether it's their sibling or their firstborn child or spreading it across their children equally, trying to be fair. Right? Well, it's, I think, really eye-opening when you actually find yourself acting as an executor. Oftentimes, the people who have done it once respectfully decline to do it a second time, or they outsource that work. That's where a trust company like Scotiatrust can actually step in. People can hire us to do that work for them, or they can renounce in our favor and we can step in and do it once they realize just how much work is there. Even the idea of having multiple kids and wanting them all to share that quote honor, that's challenging, right? Because you're relying on them to exercise their judgment and discretion, but now you're spreading that out across multiple people and disagreements can happen. People have different points of view on how things should happen or what mom and dad really wanted. So there's quite a lot of complexity that comes with choosing an executor and the work that's involved.
So if you hire a trustee, Scotiatrust or somebody else to manage the execution of your will, those people have to get paid. Where does that money come from?
They don't have to get paid, but they're entitled to payment, right? I mean, I talked earlier about just how much effort is involved in actually acting as an executor. And so provincial legislation does allow executors to be paid. And so when you hire a family member, they may or may not. I've seen certainly examples where the family member charged their full entitlement of it, but some would not take any money, right? Because they didn't want to take away from the estate. Those costs are going to come from the estate. So they'll ultimately reduce what's payable to the beneficiaries. When you hire a professional trustee, they're certainly going to charge, as does Scotiatrust, less than what the provinces would allow, but still something that reflects the level of work that's involved, the professionalism and expertise and experience that a professional trustee brings to the equation, and frankly, a good investment, I think, in ensuring that the estate gets administered effectively.
Right.
So in as much as Scotiatrust can act as a corporate executor, not everybody does need a professional trust company to play that role. I think as there's more complexity, both in terms of assets, so, you know, you've got businesses and international holdings and, you know, a lot of different moving parts, or where you have that family complexity, the potential for conflict, blended families, second marriages, those kinds of things might lend themselves to a professional trustee. But where it's a straightforward situation, you know, it's not always going to be quite as much value that we can add into the mix.
Okay, moving on from the executor, let's go over some of the other roles that might need to be appointed when making a will. One that you already mentioned is a guardian.
That would be a big one. Again, not everybody's going to have minor children they need to think about, but if you do have them, you absolutely need to be naming a guardian in your will. Somebody, again, that you're going to trust to raise your children the way that you would have wanted to raise them. I would say another one to think about is sometimes the assets are going to go to beneficiaries. Beneficiary is another role in all of this. And you don't necessarily want it all to go to them at once. Some people can't handle managing a large sum of money all at once based on their age, based on just their personalities. You know, we see oftentimes people that don't know how to manage their finances very well. And so as a parent, you might worry about giving them control of that all at once. And so this is where you could potentially put money into a trust. And so that opens the door to another role, which is the trustee of that trust, somebody that is going to honor the terms that you've outlined in the trust, how that money should be administered for the benefit of that individual. And that oftentimes means saying no to people who would like more income or would like to access the capital earlier than you wanted to, right? So again, similar to executor, you want somebody who's going to have the fortitude to stick to your wishes that you've expressed and not be swayed by potentially family members where there's an emotional connection there trying to influence how the trust should be managed. But trustee would be another one of those roles that could potentially fall in with a will.
Right.
What I would say that's really important about all of these roles is to talk to the people that are in these plans that you're naming, just to make sure that they're prepared to step in and actually act in those roles.
In a general sense, not necessarily in a case where there is a trustee, how much room to maneuver is there with a will? Like if people think they should be getting more of the estate, and obviously there are family conflicts that can take place and so on. Is that pretty common? Does it just mean these things end up in court?
They often can, right? And I think this speaks to being prepared, documenting as much as possible, covering as much as you can in the will so that it's very clear. As an executor, you really need to follow the terms of the will. There really shouldn't be leeway in terms of what is outlined in the will.
Right.
And that's where you do see some of that conflict arise where, one sibling might be getting a bigger portion than another and wondering why. And surely that can't be right, but that is not up to the executor to choose. That was up to the individual that wrote the will. So the executor's job is to make sure that what is in the will happens. As I said earlier, not everything is necessarily going to be captured, right? Mom's tea set or dad's watch or these things that might have that emotional connection may not all be captured there. And that's where when the executor steps in and starts trying to deal with all of these different belongings, they might need to exercise a little bit of judgment around, well, what kind of conversations might have been had and how do you try to be as fair as possible in divvying up some of these things that aren't necessarily accounted for in there. Now, they may use different approaches, not necessarily judgment, right? They could use a lottery, an auction, maybe some other tactic. But I would say that the need for this could be lessened if they actually made specific bequests of certain possessions. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. If you know that there's an item that means something to somebody, just put it in your will and make reference to it. That risk of family conflict is always there. And one of the things we certainly try to encourage clients to do that can help with that is to talk to their family about their intentions within the will. When you're gone and people are realizing what the will says, without some of those conversations having happened, they're left to try to figure out what you were thinking when you made those decisions. So having the benefit of being able to know, well, this is what mom or dad intended or whomever can really go a long way to taking the temperature down a little bit and lessening the risk of siblings fighting with one another about who should have had what. And I don't know, I talked to mom that day, we went on a walk and she said X and So putting as many of the cards on the table as possible really could go a long way in helping in that regard.
So be as detailed as possible in the will and then communicate with people before you're gone.
I think those are two really good pieces of advice. Yeah. Although there can be challenges when you're overly specific. This is where good legal advice is going to help you make sure that your will is written as effectively as possible. But communication, absolutely critical. And it's not always easy to do this, right? Like there's different levels of comfort with some of these things. Sure. Lots of people don't like to talk financial with their kids, but you don't even need to get into the details of the what and the how much, as long as you're talking about the why and the who and higher level intentions of what you're trying to accomplish with your estate plan. I think that in and of itself goes a long way. And the more detailed you can be, I think the better. Another thing that can help is something that we call a letter of wishes, where you can outline just a little bit more detail than what's in the will. It's not binding, but it's another way of providing additional detail to an executor.
Maybe save your family a lot of anxiety after the fact.
100%, for sure. Okay. And the trust company as an executor has a lot of experience dealing with these estates with beneficiaries and siblings who didn't know, who were blindsided by the fact that, first of all, they weren't bestowed the honor of being the executor. We were hired. And so being able to articulate to them ahead of time why they hired a professional and not downloading it to them would be helpful. But secondly, being surprised at how the estate is being distributed and trying to convince us that that wasn't what their intentions were. But at the end of the day, all we can go with is what is in the will.
I think a lot of people might assume that when you go, your estate, your money would just automatically go to your spouse. So why bother having a will? Is that a misconception?
It absolutely is one. There are certain vehicles that tend to go directly to your spouse. Think about registered assets. A registered retirement savings plan typically benefits from rolling over to your spouse as long as they've been named as beneficiary. Assets that you hold with them jointly with rights of survivorship. That means that the survivor takes over sole ownership when you pass away. Think about a home. So there are some things that do that. But when you get into your estate and assets that are flowing through your estate, if you don't have a will, then as I said earlier, there's provincial rules around how your estate is divided, and it's usually not 100% to your spouse. Your spouse is in there, but so would other stakeholders, kids, potentially other family members. So if all you have is a spouse, then it is. But if you have kids, then they're in there. If you don't have either a spouse or kids, then there's other family members that are going to find their way in there as well. So rather than leaving it up to provincial guidelines, this is where if your intention is to have everything go to your spouse, the best way to ensure that that happens is to capture that in a will.
Okay. So if somebody's listening to this and they're persuaded by everything you said and decide they need to get a will, where should they start? I imagine there are lots of options depending on the complexity of their financial situation.
I would first of all take just a little bit of a step back and talk about kind of being prepared more broadly. I think hopefully if you're thinking about this, it's also in the context of a financial plan, which covers a lot of different areas. And estate planning is a critical part of that. And having a will is a foundational part of the estate plan. But if you're working with an advisor, they can help you make sure that what you're doing aligns to the rest of your plan and just having that right context. But as far as actually preparing the will itself, most people would tend to work with a lawyer to draft a will, a notary in the province of Quebec, ideally a lawyer that has expertise in estates. There is a cost to doing that, but there are also other options that are a little bit less costly. So Scotiabank has a partnership with Willful that allows people to create a will online, just a little bit of lower cost point than a typical lawyer would. And so when you've got, a less complicated situation, either you're younger, you don't have as many assets, et cetera, that might work really well for you. As you get a little bit older, you have more assets, there's more complexity in your life. I think you really want to make sure that you're getting good legal advice to ensure that the will is getting drafted and considering all of the different implications there. And that's probably a cost that's well worth it in the long run, right? I think there's the potential that not investing in that could lead to potentially more cost down the road.
And if you already have a will, how often should you be going back and looking at it? I mean, you've already sort of connected it to a broader financial planning strategy. Is it like as frequently as you're checking in on your portfolio or checking in with your advisor?
Yeah, I mean, probably not quite as often. I mean, it's really about when life changes, right? When life changes, you want to make sure that your will evolves with it as needed. So maybe, every so often, at least every 5 years, I would say. But as you get older, probably more frequently, maybe annually. Otherwise, you really want to make sure that you're doing it as events unfold. So, you get married, remarried, divorced, sell a business, kids go through different stages, grandkids, what have you. But also, I would say the person that you named as an executor the first time around may or may not still be in the position to be the best choice later on down the road. So that would be another thing just to take into account as you're thinking about your will and whether it continues to meet your needs as your life evolves.
And is a will just one part of estate planning, or what else would be part of that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would say it's kind of the foundational piece. We already talked about how it's 1A and powers of attorney are 1B. So certainly those two foundational components, but it goes even beyond that. Anything that's going to allow for your estate to transition as efficiently and effectively as possible. So that could include a bunch of different strategies or vehicles. That could involve tax planning, certainly investment planning, kind of how you're structuring your investments. Could include the use of trusts, could include philanthropy, certainly could include life insurance. So it really is a variety of different things. Having the will and the POA foundational, but estate planning is more than just that.
Right. So even like thinking about what your assets consist of, if everything you have is in RRSPs and mutual funds or whatever, thinking about what the tax implications are of somebody inheriting all of that, because it might be different from some other type of financial asset.
Yeah, for sure. If it's an RSP, who's the beneficiary? So some of your wealth is immediately going to that beneficiary, whether it's a spouse or another named beneficiary. And so how does that affect the beneficiaries that you're outlining in your will. How are assets owned? Are those investment accounts owned joint with rights of survivorship or in some other way? Same goes with other assets. So I think there's different considerations in terms of how you structure your investments and other assets that factor into that estate planning.
So there's no estate tax in Canada as such, as I understand it, which doesn't mean that the assets, once a person dies, won't be subject to sort of final tax considerations.
Yeah, no, far from it. You're right. Unlike the US, we don't have a quote unquote estate tax, but the reality is that when you die, you're deemed to have disposed of all of your assets. And so there's a couple of things that happen there. One, if you haven't named your spouse as beneficiary of your registered plans or successor holder in the case of a TFSA, then all that value is taken into taxable income in your estate. Secondly, your assets are deemed to have been sold. And if they've increased in value, that could trigger a capital gain, which is also taxable, albeit to a lesser degree. There are ways of doing planning in your estate to try to lessen the tax liability, but those are two really important things to be aware of. And so again, that all goes back to a big part of estate planning is tax planning and tax considerations and making sure that there's a good appreciation for what is the projected tax liability when you pass away and how are you managing that as effectively as possible.
So just put it in its simplest terms, money that a beneficiary might get from somebody's estate when they pass, what they get is not taxable. But the estate itself is subject to whatever final tax provisions are going to happen.
Correct. And that's a big part of the estate administration process that an executor would oversee. They would need to make sure that all of those tax liabilities have been addressed. One of the final steps in the process is to actually get tax clearance from Canada Revenue Agency that says, yes, everything is good. You've paid the tax bills. Now you can distribute the estate as it sets out in the will. And then what the beneficiaries receive, generally there's no tax there. However, any income earned after the date of death could be taxed in the hands of the beneficiaries. So just something to be conscious of.
Okay. How much of estate planning is about communicating with your family about end of life intentions?
Yeah, I mean, we talked earlier about the importance of communicating, and I think that that does extend to things that go beyond the financial, right? What you want to have happen with final resting place, and are you going to be buried or cremated or anything else? So rather than force people to guess or to apply their own preferences or values to that decision, this is a chance to make sure that your own preferences are well known. So whether that's outlined in the will or just simply part of a conversation with your executor and your families, it's really important to make sure that those needs are known. And as I said earlier, I think the more that you communicate about ultimately what you want to have happen, then the less likely you are to have any sort of conflict. I mean, even final resting place, that could be a source of conflict among siblings who might have different perspectives on where you valued that final resting place to be more than another. So again, communication is such a critical part of this whole exercise, and I really can't stress that enough.
Okay. Obviously, estate planning and wills and so on are not just a concern for seniors, but often as you get older, you will be thinking about these a little bit more. Scotiabank has made commitments around something called the Seniors Code. Can you tell us what that is and how that fits into this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, Scotiabank is a proud signatory of the Code of Conduct for the delivery of banking services to seniors, which reflects Scotiabank's commitment to helping Canadians age with confidence. The bank has a dedicated seniors team led by a seniors champion that advocates for continually addressing the diverse banking and accessibility needs of seniors. They also are really focused on education and training, so both for employees to ensure that they're well equipped to deal with the evolving needs of Canadians as they age, as well as for seniors themselves, helping them stay financially safe, learning how to protect yourself from fraud and from scams, which are unfortunately a reality of our world today. So there's quite a bit that the bank is doing to really focus on how to ensure that seniors can bank with confidence.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to wrap up here. Before we go, what's one thing you would like people to take away from this conversation?
Well, I just think this is such a critical thing, right? It'll sound silly, but this is the one unavoidable inevitability in our lives. And so, it can be an uncomfortable thing to talk about, but it just makes sense to address it and be prepared. Think about it in a very practical way. It's better to be prepared than to not be prepared. And so it's fine to think you've got lots of time to deal with this, but none of us knows when exactly that time is going to come. So I would just encourage people to not procrastinate and to really have the estate planning conversation with your advisor, develop that plan that includes the estate plan with a will at its foundation, and then to have those conversations that really are going to help allow for the execution of that estate plan to unfold as seamlessly as possible.
Rob, thanks so much. That was a great conversation. Appreciate you coming in.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I've been speaking with Rob McGavin. He is the managing director at Scotiatrust. The Perspectives podcast is made by me, Stephen Maurice, as well as Armina Lagaya and our producer, Andrew Norton. For a transcript of this episode, as well as other stories, insights, analysis, and thought leadership, visit our website, scotiabank.com/perspectives. We'll see you next time.